thanks everybody for joining UCF's Venture Lunch. This talk today is going to be about startup company formation. We have the lovely Ed Alexander. He's a very talented, experienced attorney that's here local in the Orlando region. And so for those of you that are not familiar, UCF's Technology Transfer Department is one of the most prestigious in the country. Almost 1,000 patents have been issued, and there are approximately 33 startups that are still in business as of today. If you're not familiar, we do founders talks, and so we have been actively bringing in a founder, UCF founder, to come in and speak about their experience, often using the different resources within UCF, including the Technology Transfer Office. The UCF Venture Lunch program is a program that's sponsored by Orange County government, and really the purpose is to be able to lift university innovation and research kind of out of the university and put it into out for public use. And so our support of UCF academic staff, faculty, postdocs, and graduate students is to really be able to provide a no-cost, very convenient program schedule for education, networking purposes. Our goal is that we want to give you a pretty good understanding as to the types of corporations and some of the legal problems that startups face. So with all of that being said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ed Alexander, who is a business lawyer and founder of Alexander Abramson.
Hello, everybody. So I'd like to start off with kind of a little bit of a background kind of mindset before we get into the details. This is one of my favorite curves, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the bottom line of this curve is that it really proves that the concept of knowing enough to be dangerous is actually true. Because when we learn a little bit, we think we have more capability than we actually do. If we look at this, that upward side of the curve on the far left shows us that this is the area of I don't know what I don't know. This area back here is knowing that I don't know a lot of stuff, and then obviously we come up to kind of expert status over here. As an entrepreneur, your task is to reduce the risk in your venture, and really risk is this multivariable equation. It's just not a single approach. It's got to be approached from the perspective of both a money perspective, both a legal risk perspective, a financial risk perspective, and those all have to be balanced together. All right, so now we'll get into kind of the business entity options. These are the four major options. You got a sole proprietorship, a partnership, a limited liability company, or a corporation. So a sole proprietorship is when you decide to go into business, you do nothing more, and you just go out and engage in business activities alone, just yourself, right? Now, the sole proprietorship leaves you open to all the risks, all the liabilities of the business venture itself. Now, the difference between a sole proprietorship and a partnership is that instead of just doing it alone, you're doing it with another person. And the risks there are that that other person now can create obligations for you. And so not only are you liable for the debts and obligations of the business venture that you create, you are now obligated for all the debts and obligations of the business venture that your partners create on top of it. But as of today, nobody should be in business as a sole proprietorship, because there is a way that you can get the benefits of the sole proprietorship, which is really the ease of formation, the ease of operation. The most popular form of business entity in the state of Florida today is the limited liability company. I've underlined company because I hear people say a limited liability corporation. That is not it. An LLC is a limited liability company. A limited liability company is like a corporation because it's an entity that's separate and apart from its owners, which means it's kind of a legal fiction, but we treat it as something that exists. And so it can sue, it can be sued, it can own assets, it can accept funds, it can do all sorts of things that basically you or I could do, except vote, I guess, right? Other than that, it does what we do. The owners of a limited liability company are called its members. Now, if you were to just form a limited liability company through the state of Florida using sunbiz.org, and you did nothing but submit the sample documents that they provide, you would have a member managed company. And we would go along. And if you think about it, the LLC is really designed for a small mom and pop business where the owners are actively involved in the day-to-day operation of the business. There's a lot of advantages with an LLC because it gives you some real flexibility in tax status. It also gives you flexibility in the relationship of the owners. You can create pretty much any contract relationship among the various owners. There's 17 areas where you can't change the statute, but everything else is open, and it's a wide variety. That also becomes the disadvantage. And the disadvantage to it is that flexibility means you actually have to think things through. That if you just throw up what is available in a standard form and haven't really thought it through, you can find out later on that things aren't working the way you want them to. So to form a limited liability company, you file articles of organization with the state. So the next step is you've got to apply for a tax identification number. You do this on a form SS4 that you get from the irs.gov. Next is the operating agreement. And again, as I said, with great flexibility comes great responsibility because you have this fantastic ability to change the relationship of the owners. But if you don't do it right, then you're going to have problems from day one. The operating agreement is that arrangement where you're describing the relationship among the owners. And therefore, that operating agreement has got to be thought through and drafted properly. Then you're not obligated to, but you can issue membership certificates. And so these are literally certificates telling you how much interest you have in the LLC. Now, if you want to elect S status or something different than the default, then you have to go through your status election. Once you enter a contract, unless all of the parties agree, you're stuck with that contract. Now, if everybody agrees to make a change, you're good to go. You can make whatever changes you want. So next is a corporation. Like an LLC, a corporation is an entity separate and apart from its owners. Corporations are set up so that management is separated from ownership. That is the default scenario. So the advantages of a corporation are this structure is very, very well known. It's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The modern corporation has certainly been around for 100 years. And we have this kind of uniformity throughout the states in terms of treating corporations as the same. So if I create a corporation in Delaware, it's going to be treated similarly in Florida and also in New York and all these other places. The disadvantage is that majority rules. And so if we want to change majority rule, we've got to set that up ahead of time. And so two ways to do that. One is we can have a shareholders agreement that gives certain of the shareholders rights to vote or rights to veto or the ability to control certain things that the majority then has to go along with the minority. Or we can set up voting and non-voting equity. So we can have common voting and we can also have common non-voting. And the common non-voting just participates from an economic perspective, not from a voting and management perspective. So I think it's important when we talk about corporations in particular, that we set some base level parameters around corporate finance, right? As a shareholder, your interest in the corporation is always determined by the number of shares that you hold divided by the number of shares that are in the hands of all of the shareholders. Now, when you look at the articles of incorporation, you'll see that the corporation is authorized to issue 1 million shares, right? Now, if it's authorized to issue 1 million shares, but I issue myself 1 share and there are no other shareholders, I'm 100% owner of that corporation. And so the number of shares that's listed in the articles of incorporation is there. It's called authorized stock. It's there just to say what the maximum possible number of shares could be that could be in the hands of shareholders. But the ownership piece is based on what's in the hands of shareholders. And it's always that ratio, what I own to the total number of shares that are held by all of the shareholders. And that's issued stock. Okay, so I become a shareholder. What do I get? What are my rights? Well, my rights depend on a number of things. At a base level, I get the right to vote for the board of directors. I get the right to receive the distribution of profits when and if declared by the board of directors. And I get the right to receive the distribution of liquidation proceeds. So again, if we sell the business, then the company's dissolved and I get whatever's left over, the net amount. So how do we form a corporation? We file articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. Once the articles are filed, the board of directors, which are typically identified in the articles of organization, have an organizational meeting where they adopt the bylaws, they issue the stock, they perhaps adopt a shareholders agreement, and they make a decision whether or not to make an S election or some other tax-related item. So when do we create an entity? Which one question that I think came up. Anytime that you are going out and you have multiple owners, right? You want to create an entity because you don't want to be a partnership. You don't want to be a general partnership. So the question then becomes which entity to use. If you want a pass-through tax entity and not all of the owners are eligible to hold S corporation stock, you got to go with an LLC. However, corporation is a much better alternative if you're going to be raising outside capital, or if you have an employee incentive plan, so stock option plan or something like that, where you've got people who are coming on board who aren't necessarily part of the management of the business itself. And so the question then comes up, well, wait a second, I create an LLC on the corporation or vice versa. And so we can convert a corporation into an LLC and an LLC into a corporation at any point in time. So if you created the wrong entity because maybe in a year or two you want to raise capital and you created an LLC, don't worry about it. Continue to work with the LLC, and when it comes time to raise capital, we can convert that entity into a corporation on the eve of getting that investment. Well, how does UCF licensed technology impact this? Well, it impacts it in 2 ways. One is the type of entity. For the most part, right, when you license UCF technology as a startup, right, there's kind of 2 flavors of it, but as a startup, then UCF is going to take shares of capital stock in your entity. And so obviously you need to be a corporation there. And then from a tax perspective, UCF is not an eligible S Corp shareholder. So that means that you're going to end up being a C corporation. There are 3 types of taxation: disregarded taxation, entity taxation, which you might have heard as C Corp, and then pass-through taxation, which are referred to as S Corp or general partnership taxation. C Corp status or entity taxation. So we have a corporation, right? We've got 2 shareholders in the corporation. The corporation does business, it makes money, it pays its expenses, and at the end of the year, the silent partner shows up and demands its cut. And so the corporation files its 1120, Form 1120. You and I file 1040, it files Form 1120, and then it pays a flat tax of 21%. And that's as of the 2017 tax changes. Let's say that we're keeping the money in the corporation. We want to grow the corporation. That's it. That's where we stop. But if we want to make a distribution to the shareholders, we want to give them the profit, then what we're going to do is we're going to write checks. Those checks are dividends. And with those dividends, the shareholders then have to report that dividend income on their Form 1040. And they pay a flat rate of 15%. And so this is what you've heard to as double taxation. When you hear double taxation, it's because the corporation is taxed, and then if and only if the corporation pays a dividend to the shareholders are taxed. Next, we have a pass-through entity. We have the same exact setup, a corporation with doing business and making money, and then we file a tax return. In this case, we're filing Form 1120S because this is an S Corp tax return. Now, if we did it as a partnership, it would be a different tax return. But notice the important point here is that the entity doesn't pay any tax most of the time. Instead, it issues what's called a K-1 statement to the shareholders. And it says, okay, we made $210 in profit. We made $1,000 in profit. So shareholder one, you're a 50% shareholder, you get a $500 K-1. And shareholder number two, you get a $500 K-1. Now, they don't, notice that these lines aren't green. They don't have to get a check. They just get a K-1, right? So this is basically the corporation telling the shareholders, oh, by the way, here is your tax, additional income for taxes that you have to put on your tax return. So as a shareholder, now I have to include that money on my 1040, and I have to pay tax on it. And the tax rate varies, but overall, the idea is that this rate should be less than or equal to the rate that you pay for a C Corp. Pass-through makes the most sense because it's the lowest rate. Why wouldn't we do it? Well, because if I'm an investor, I don't want that K-1 when I'm not getting money, number one. So I don't want phantom income. Number two, we have limitations on the types of shareholders. They can be individuals, US citizens. They can be qualifying trusts. And if we have an entity, an owner, we can't be an S Corp. We can't be that type of pass-through. And we can't have preferred stock. And the investors want to have preferred stock because they want their money out first. Okay, so what happens with non-US citizen owners, right? So first thing to remember is there's no prohibition on a non-US citizen owning equity in a business entity in the United States. You must secure an international taxpayer identification number through the IRS. You're typically going to have to be a C Corp status, or you can be a general partnership pass-through entity. And most of the times there is going to be backup withholding associated with that. So hiring an attorney. So when do you hire an attorney? Most people wait too late to hire an attorney. It is best to hire an attorney on the verge of doing your first important transaction. There's a lot of benefit that comes from having an attorney who understands your business and knows what's going on, because one aspect of your business can affect another aspect of the business. Understanding how you operate will play into doing contracts for you properly, will play into making sure that the structures that are in place work for you based on what you're doing today. So there's there's this kind of background information that a good corporate attorney can bring to bear to make their representation of your company much, much more effective. The problem is that contracts, although they're like software in the context that they're operational documents, they're not like software because you don't get to run it and see what happens. Once you sign the contract, you're locked. And unless everybody agrees, as I said before, unless everybody agrees, you're not getting out of that contract. So you've got to be sure that it operates properly. And part of that is considering the mechanics of it. It's making sure there are no outside verbal agreements, right? Because as humans, we have terrible memories. We always remember things in the light most favorable to ourselves. And therefore, what we agreed to 6 months ago, we're never going to remember what it actually is, unless it's in a written document, and that document is comprehensive. Next is use of forms. They're great tools, but if you don't know how to use the tool, what's going to come out is something completely different. So how do we avoid legal disputes? What isn't there can be more important than what actually is there. For most early stage companies, confidential information, trade secrets, know-how are the lifeblood. They are the secret sauce of that entity. And a lot of times they don't have patents, or maybe the patents are in process or something like that. Or the secret sauce is the add-on to the patent that makes it so much better. And so non-disclosure agreements represent an enormous risk to early stage companies. And a lot of entrepreneurs approach this just saying, hey, this is a form, I'm just going to go ahead and sign it. It's kind of a standard thing. And it's not a standard thing. So separate out the what it does from the how it does it, right? And if you can talk about the what, the outcomes, the benefits, those types of things, without getting too far into the details, that's a good first step. Find out whether the relationship will work before you start to show up and throw up and just disclose all of this information that really shouldn't be out in the domain there. Because once it's out in the domain, once that another party has that, you can't pull it back. And if you have to try and enforce a non-disclosure agreement against a large organization, it's truly David and Goliath, only in this case, David is going to lose because they have a lot more money than you. They have a lot more ability for staying power in a fight like that. The next thing that comes up is the length of the secrecy obligation. I see things in agreements that say the confidentiality obligations shall continue for 12 months or 3 years or 5 years. And I always push back and say, you have to keep it confidential as long as it's confidential. Because in this agreement, if it becomes not confidential other than something that the recipient did, then the protection isn't warranted. But if you arbitrarily set a time limit, then what you're doing is telling the other party they can use your information. They can disclose it and they can use it at some point in time that has no bearing on whether or not that information remains confidential. So non-disclosure agreements, if you get one with a large organization, it really behooves you to sit down and talk with somebody about that non-disclosure agreement. And then when it comes to these types of things, one thing you might want to do with an attorney is to set up your firm's standard non-disclosure agreement. And there's something magical about sticking the word standard on any document, because a lot of people won't attempt to negotiate a standard document. That's why we do it. We say, all right, this is the standard NDA, and send it to clients and they'll use it. And most of the time it goes through. So
thank you very much for making the time and putting the materials together.